Imagine opening your eyes beneath the blazing African sun 300,000 years ago. The air is warm, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant rain. Somewhere beyond the acacia trees, a deep rumble rolls across the landscape. Birds erupt into the sky. Herds shift uneasily. Every instinct tells you that something enormous is approaching. You scan the horizon, expecting a mammoth or perhaps one of the saber-toothed predators you've seen in museums. Instead, what emerges looks strangely familiar: an elephant. But as it draws closer, you realize your eyes aren't deceiving you. This isn't the elephant you know. It's taller than a house, armed with impossibly long tusks, and powerful enough to make every other creature nearby step aside. That first surprise captures what traveling back to the dawn of our species would really feel like. The world wouldn't seem completely alien. In fact, much of it would look surprisingly recognizable. Yet almost everything would be just different enough to remind you that you've stepped into another age. If the entire 4.5 billion year history of Earth were compressed into a single 24-hour day, modern humans would appear less than 8 seconds before midnight. That's all Homo sapiens have occupied the stage. 8 fleeting seconds in a story that began long before mountains, forests, or even dinosaurs existed. And yet, within that tiny sliver of time, our ancestors entered a world unlike anything alive today. So, what would you actually see if you stood beside the very first modern humans? Not endless fields of mammoths, not packs of saber-toothed cats lurking behind every tree. Those iconic Ice Age animals belonged largely to other continents or had already vanished from Africa by the time our species emerged. Instead, you'd find an ecosystem filled with creatures that looked almost modern at first glance: elephants, buffalo, rhinos, giraffes, and antelope. Look a little closer, however, and each one reveals an unsettling twist. They were larger, stranger, and in many cases far more formidable than the animals that survive today. The reason this scene feels so uncanny is that Africa followed a very different evolutionary path from much of the rest of the world. While Europe, Asia, Australia, and eventually the Americas saw waves of giant mammals appear and disappear as climates shifted and ice sheets advanced, Africa remained comparatively stable. Its grasslands expanded and contracted over millions of years. But the continent never experienced the same degree of environmental upheaval. As a result, many of the great animals that evolved alongside our distant ancestors simply endured, adapting instead of vanishing. That long evolutionary partnership also came with consequences. Predators became better hunters, herbivores became harder to kill, and the earliest Homo sapiens inherited a landscape where survival meant competing against animals that had already spent millions of years perfecting their defenses. Rather than being filled with bizarre creatures unlike anything alive today, prehistoric Africa was populated by familiar faces that seemed to have been exaggerated by evolution itself. No animal embodied that better than the giant elephant known as Palaeoloxodon. From a distance, you might mistake it for an African elephant. It had the same sweeping trunk, broad ears, and slow, deliberate stride. But every step closer shattered that illusion. The species that early modern humans likely encountered, Palaeoloxodon galenus, was descended from some of the largest elephants ever to exist. Based on the available fossil evidence, it may have stood nearly 14 feet tall at the shoulder and weighed around 15 tons. To put that into perspective, the largest African bush elephants alive today rarely exceed 10 tons. This prehistoric giant could outweigh them by roughly 50%, making it one of the largest land mammals ever to walk the earth. Its tusks were just as astonishing. Unlike the more curved tusks of modern elephants, those of Palaeoloxodon projected farther forward and remained relatively straight, extending so far that they approached the ground. These weren't simply oversized ornaments. Their shape allowed the elephant to manipulate the landscape itself, pushing aside vegetation, digging into the soil, and sweeping obstacles from its path. Every movement advertised incredible strength. Its skull reveals another remarkable adaptation. Rising above the forehead were large bony crests unlike those of living elephants. These weren't decorative features. They served as anchor points for massive neck muscles capable of supporting the tremendous weight of those elongated tusks. Every swing of its head became more powerful, turning the tusks into formidable tools and, If threatened, devastating weapons. Few predators would have considered attacking a healthy adult, yet one species may have tried anyway, although archaeologists have not uncovered definitive proof that early Homo sapiens regularly hunted Palaeoloxodon galenus. The idea is far from impossible. Other human species living in Eurasia successfully hunted similarly enormous members of the same elephant lineage using wooden spears and carefully coordinated attacks. By the time our own species appeared, humans had already developed sophisticated stone tools and throwing weapons that dramatically increased both range and accuracy. A direct confrontation would have been extraordinarily dangerous, but ancient hunters rarely relied on strength alone. Patience, planning, teamwork, and intimate knowledge of animal behavior often proved more valuable than raw power. Even so, pursuing a 15-ton elephant would almost certainly have been the exception rather than the rule. Why risk everything against the largest animal in Africa when the continent offered countless other sources of food that were smaller, more abundant, and seemingly easier to bring down? As it turns out, smaller did not necessarily mean safer. Some of the most intimidating creatures roaming this ancient landscape stood well below an elephant's shoulder, but possessed a temperament that made even experienced hunters think twice. One of the best examples was Syncerus antiquus, better known as the giant buffalo. Calling it a buffalo almost undersells what it really was. At first glance, it resembled the Cape buffalo that still roams Africa today, but almost every dimension had been turned up. Adults stretched nearly 10 feet in length, stood over 6 feet tall at the shoulder, and the largest males weighed more than 2 tons, placing them in the same weight class as a modern white rhinoceros. Unlike a rhino, however, nearly all of that mass came from dense muscle supported by an exceptionally robust skeleton. Its most striking feature was impossible to ignore. Sweeping outward from its skull were enormous horns that may have spanned close to 10 feet from tip to tip. They curved much like those of living water buffalo, only on a scale rarely seen in any hoofed mammal. In fact, their horn spread rivaled or exceeded that of many horned dinosaurs, despite the buffalo being only a fraction of their size. These weren't ornamental displays. They were powerful weapons capable of tossing predators into the air or crushing ribs with a single well-placed charge. Evidence suggests these animals didn't hesitate to use them. Across southern Africa, prehistoric artists repeatedly painted giant buffalo in scenes of violent clashes. More than almost any other large mammal, they were shown locking horns in brutal contests with rivals, implying an aggressive temperament that early humans would have quickly learned to respect. Add in estimated running speeds approaching 35 miles per hour, and a charging Syncerus antiquus would have been every bit as terrifying as any lion. For hunters, this presented a difficult calculation. A giant buffalo offered an enormous reward in meat, hides, and bone, but bringing one down required coordination that few predators could achieve. A careless approach meant facing several thousand pounds of muscle accelerating directly toward you with a pair of spear-like horns leading the charge. Hunting was never simply about courage. It demanded planning, patience, and an intimate understanding of herd behavior, terrain, and timing. That lesson extended across much of prehistoric Africa because many familiar-looking animals carried prehistoric upgrades of their own. Warthogs, for example, had giant relatives belonging to the genus Metridiocurus. Some species grew to the size of small horses while remaining remarkably compact and muscular. Their foretusks were proportionally longer and straighter than those of living warthogs, transforming an already aggressive animal into one that few predators would challenge lightly. Northern Africa was also home to the steppe rhinoceros, a species adapted to cooler environments and thought to have carried a light coat of hair across its body. Roughly comparable in size to today's white rhinoceros, it wandered woodlands and open country alike. Archaeological sites show that ancient humans hunted these formidable animals with carefully crafted stone-tipped spears, demonstrating that intelligence and teamwork could overcome even heavily armored prey. Elsewhere, giraffes reached slightly greater heights than those alive today, browsing leaves that few other herbivores could reach, while extinct zebra species grazed regions that are now barren desert, reminding us that Africa's landscapes looked very different during periods of changing climate. Together, these animals shaped far more than the scenery. Every hunt became an exercise in observation rather than brute force. Early Homo sapiens learned which herds were alert, which individuals were vulnerable, how wind carried scent, and when patience mattered more than speed. Those skills didn't evolve in response to predators alone. They were forged just as much by prey capable of fighting back, and in many cases, the most dangerous thing on the savannah wasn't hunting you at all. Even if you mastered the dangers of elephants, buffalo, and rhinoceroses, there was another encounter that could be even more unsettling. Somewhere beyond the next valley, watching the same herds and following the same rivers, there might have been another group of humans. They walked upright. They made tools. They hunted. They gathered around fires at night. But they were not Homo sapiens. One of the biggest misconceptions about human evolution is that it unfolded like a straight line, with one species replacing the next until modern humans finally appeared. The reality was far more complicated. For long stretches of prehistory, multiple human species shared the landscape, each representing a different evolutionary experiment. Around 300,000 years ago, when Homo sapiens first emerged, Africa may have been home to several of them at once. Among the most familiar was Homo heidelbergensis, a species that in many ways seemed remarkably modern. Individuals stood about as tall as we do and possessed brains approaching the size of our own. Yet their bodies were built differently. Broad chests, thick limb bones, and powerful muscles gave them a sturdier frame that would likely have made them stronger than the average modern human. Archaeological discoveries associate them with sophisticated stone tools, controlled use of fire, wooden spears, and even the construction of simple shelters. These were not primitive cave dwellers stumbling through the wilderness. They were skilled hunters capable of cooperating in large groups to bring down dangerous game. Some researchers have even suggested they possessed a form of speech. Fossils of the hyoid bone, which supports the tongue, along with studies of their middle ear anatomy, indicate they may have been capable of producing and hearing sounds within ranges important for spoken language. Whether their conversations resembled ours is impossible to know, but the possibility raises an extraordinary question. If two groups met along a riverbank, would the first sounds exchanged have been shouts of warning, or the earliest attempt at communication between different human species? Closely related to them was Homo rhodesiensis, known primarily from Central and Southern Africa. Its exact place on the human family tree remains debated, with some scientists considering it a distinct species, while others view it as part of Homo heidelbergensis. Either way, it represents another population that may have shared parts of the continent with the earliest Homo sapiens. Their hunting grounds, migration routes, and sources of fresh water could easily have overlapped, creating opportunities for cooperation, competition, or simple avoidance. Then there was perhaps the strangest member of this ancient community, Homo naledi. Unlike the robust hunters, Homo naledi looked almost like a living mosaic of different evolutionary stages. Its body retained several primitive traits, including shoulders and curved fingers well suited for climbing, suggesting it still spent considerable time in trees. It was also much smaller than modern humans, with a brain only a fraction of our size. Yet despite these seemingly ancient characteristics, it survived surprisingly late in prehistory, meaning its existence overlapped with the rise of our own species. Imagine catching sight of such a figure moving silently through the woodland. It would walk like a human, use its hands like a human, and gaze back with unmistakably human eyes. But something about it would feel profoundly different. Not animal, not quite us. Whether these encounters ended in conflict, cautious observation, the exchange of knowledge, or even interbreeding remains one of the greatest mysteries in human evolution. What is becoming increasingly clear, however, is that when our species first stepped onto the stage, it did not inherit an empty world. It entered one that already belonged to other humans, and some of the strangest neighbors waiting to be discovered weren't human at all. As remarkable as those encounters with other human species would have been, they weren't the strangest sights awaiting the first Homo sapiens. Scattered across Africa were animals so unusual that, had they survived into the present, they would probably rank alongside the platypus as one of evolution's greatest oddities. One of them was Dinopithecus, a giant baboon whose name literally means terrible ape. Although its exact overlap with modern humans remains uncertain because of its sparse fossil record, the possibility is too fascinating to ignore. This primate dwarfed most baboons alive today, with some individuals weighing around 170 pounds. It carried an enormous skull powered by exceptionally strong jaw muscles and possessed canine teeth, roughly 20% larger than those of the biggest living baboons. Unlike monkeys that spent most of their lives in trees, Dinopithecus appears to have been largely terrestrial, roaming the same open landscapes as early humans. Fossil evidence suggests it fed heavily on fruit but was also an opportunistic omnivore, occasionally eating meat. Some paleontologists have even proposed that smaller hominin species could have fallen victim to these powerful primates. Whether or not Homo sapiens ever encountered one, it serves as a reminder that our ancestors lived in a world where even fellow primates could be formidable. If Dinopithecus looked intimidating, Rusingoryx was simply bewildering. At first glance, it resembled an ordinary wildebeest-sized antelope grazing peacefully across the plains. But hidden inside its skull was one of the strangest adaptations ever discovered in a mammal. Large, hollow nasal chambers stretched upward through its head, forming an internal structure unlike anything seen in living hoofed animals. Oddly enough, the closest comparison isn't another mammal at all. It's the crested hadrosaurs, the duck-billed dinosaurs that disappeared 66 million years earlier. Researchers believe these chambers acted like enormous resonating tubes, allowing Rusingoryx to produce incredibly deep calls. Some may have fallen into the range of infrasound, frequencies so low that humans cannot hear them. Imagine standing in the middle of a massive migrating herd. The animals around you appear almost silent, yet they could be communicating across long distances through vibrations passing unnoticed beneath your hearing. Unlike many extinct African mammals, Rusingoryx left behind direct evidence of its relationship with our species. Archaeological sites in Kenya have uncovered butchered bones lying alongside stone tools, indicating that early humans hunted these animals successfully. Their herd behavior likely made them attractive prey, allowing coordinated groups of hunters to target multiple individuals during a single event. Looking back, what makes these creatures feel so extraordinary isn't that they belonged to some unimaginably distant past. It's that they lived alongside the earliest members of our own species. The line separating the modern world from this lost Africa is astonishingly thin, and yet within that narrow span of time, evolution erased some of its most fascinating experiments while allowing others to survive almost unchanged. By now, a pattern begins to emerge. The Africa that greeted the first Homo sapiens was not a forgotten world packed with monsters unlike anything alive today. Instead, it was a continent where evolution had spent millions of years refining the same cast of characters. Elephants, buffalo, rhinos, giraffes, antelope, and countless other large mammals had evolved alongside generations of hominins, each adapting to the other's presence in a slow biological arms race. This helps explain why Africa looks so different from much of the rest of the world today. While Eurasia and the Americas lost a large proportion of their giant mammals toward the end of the Ice Age, Africa retained an extraordinary share of its megafauna. Scientists continue to debate exactly why. Climate undoubtedly played a major role, reshaping habitats as temperatures and rainfall fluctuated. Human hunting almost certainly contributed in some places as well. But unlike continents where large animals encountered humans relatively suddenly, Africa's wildlife had been living alongside human ancestors for millions of years. Generation after generation, the most cautious, aggressive, or adaptable individuals were the ones that survived. The result is a continent where many of the giants that once shared the landscape with our earliest ancestors are still here. The elephants may be smaller than Palaeoloxodon. Today's buffalo no longer carry horns stretching nearly 10 feet across. The giant baboons and the strange dinosaur-sounding Rusingoryx are gone. Yet when you watch a herd of elephants crossing the savanna or giraffes browsing beneath an acacia tree, you're looking at the descendants of an ecosystem that has endured for an astonishing span of evolutionary time. In a way, that's the greatest surprise of all. The first modern humans didn't enter an unfamiliar world. They entered one that had already shaped their ancestors for millions of years. And as our species evolved, that ancient Africa continued shaping us in return, leaving traces not only in the animals that still roam its landscapes, but in the instincts, intelligence, and cooperation that allowed us to survive among them. Now imagine that 24-hour clock one last time. After an entire planet's history of drifting continents, rising mountains, mass extinctions, and countless evolutionary experiments, our species arrives with less than 8 seconds remaining before midnight. In those brief moments, the first Homo sapiens inherited a world that was already ancient, a world filled with giants, rival humans, and animals unlike anything most people imagine when they think of prehistory. Many of those extraordinary creatures have disappeared. Palaeoloxodon no longer shakes the ground with its towering frame. Giant buffalo no longer clash with horns stretching the length of a small car. The eerie calls of Rusingoryx have fallen silent forever. Yet this wasn't the end of Africa's story. Look closely at the continent today, and you'll find echoes of that forgotten world everywhere. Every elephant, buffalo, rhinoceros, giraffe, and zebra represents a surviving branch of an ecosystem that has endured for millions of years. They are not merely modern animals, they are the last living chapters of a landscape our ancestors once called home. Perhaps that's the most remarkable lesson of all. The prehistoric world isn't completely lost. Pieces of it are still walking the African savanna, carrying the legacy of an age that shaped both them and us. Protecting these animals isn't just about preserving wildlife. It's about safeguarding the final living connection to the world that made humanity possible.